Everyone, welcome back to the second half of chapters 10 and 11, talking about biogeography. So next we're going to talk about natural vegetation or native plants versus non-native and invasive plants. Here's a picture of Ocean Beach, and in Southern California, our kind of quintessential um, vegetation that we think of in Southern California, especially if you're not from here, is the palm tree, right? This is not a native species. Most palm trees that we see in California are not from here. They were brought here um, by Europeans. There is one palm that is native to California, but it's not the one that we most commonly see, especially those very tall, skinny ones. Um, what we do have are native vegetation. So this is a picture from Borderfield Beach down by Imperial Beach. Is coastal sage scrub. This is a very important native vegetation. So this was here before Europeans arrived. So native plants are species found in the area in which they evolved. And they have specific adaptations to that environment. Non-native plants are very, very common though. Most of the plants that you see on your in your day-to-day life are most likely non-native plants. We have dramatically changed the landscape and brought in tons and tons of non-native plants. If you go to Balboa Park, look at all those beautiful trees in Balboa Park, non-native plants. Eucalyptus trees, which we see all over San Diego, those are not native either. Um, some non-native plants are problematic, and then they're called invasive. They're not automatically invasive, but an invasive species is basically a species of plant that comes in, chokes everything else out, and presents some type of problem for the ecosystem. So here's a picture of ice plant, which was actually planted by Caltrans in order to prevent erosion. It tends to choke everything out. It's really, really hard to pull out. And it actually does bad things for erosion because if you get a ton of rain, those plants get very, very heavy with water and their roots do not go very deep, and you can actually lose an entire hillside from them. So these are problematic invasive plants. The Chilean wine palm is a non-native plant, but it's fine, right? It lives here. It doesn't choke everything else out. It's pretty much like an okay thing. Some people and organizations are really all about restoring things to native plants, but it's important to make the distinction between non-native and invasive. Invasives are non-native, but all non-natives are not invasives. So Chilean wine palm, okay. Ice plant, not okay. Next, we're going to talk about speciation and evolution, which you might have talked about in some other classes. I'm going to cover it relatively quickly here, but it's important for biogeography because species evolved that evolved in their habitat are very well suited for that habitat and have specific characters. So speciation is the process by which new species emerge through natural selection and evolution. Natural selection sounds a little bit different than what it actually is. Um, it's basically some organisms have an advantage and therefore they reproduce more and then their traits are passed on more. And so I will talk about that in a second. So favorable traits are selected in a gene pool, right? I'll look at the examples of giraffes. And so here, these guys here are okapis, which you can see at the San Diego Zoo. Their actually closest relative is the giraffe, but notice they do not have the long necks, but they evolved in a place with much shorter trees. And also this markings on their legs helps them camouflage within the trees where they evolved. And these form changes over time. It's not like you all of a sudden have one offspring that is part of a new species, but it's kind of this thing that happens slowly over time. We do have bursts of speciation that happen, but generally when you think about it in our lifetimes, right, it happens pretty slowly. Um, Populations separated by geography lose something called gene flow. So here is a picture of Galapagos tortoises. Um, and the Galapagos Islands are great places to study speciation. It's where Darwin went. Because if you have tortoises that evolved on one island versus tortoises that evolved on another island, they will look very, very similar, but they'll actually be different species. They can no longer reproduce together because they were isolated. Those two groups have been isolated for long enough that they have evolved long enough that they can no longer reproduce with one another. Sometimes species can reproduce together. So down at the bottom here is a picture of a liger, which is a cross between a lion and a tiger. So they're close enough genetically connected that they can have offspring, but they're not viable offspring, which means that a liger can no longer have babies, right? There's not enough genetic variation there. So there are some species that you can mate two of them together and get an offspring, but that offspring will then no longer be able to have children. Something to pay attention to, something called the latitudinal gradient. And basically that's what's saying is in places with higher biomass, with higher net primary productivity, you tend to get more species, right? So you're going to get some pretty biodiverse places near the equator as opposed to at the higher latitudes. So this is one looking at birds, right? Lots of bird species near the equator, much, much fewer bird species near the poles. And so we're going to talk about what biodiversity is. You're going to watch a little tiny video after this that defines biodiversity. But biodiversity hotspots are places on the planet that contain an incredible amount of species. So 2.3% of the land surface contains 50% of all plant species and 42% of all terrestrial vertebrate species. And these are places, a lot of them have high primary productivity, and some of them are just really unique. San Diego is considered a biodiversity hotspot. Places like the Hawaiian Islands, parts of the Amazon, parts of Europe are considered these kind of very unique biodiversity hotspots. And again, you're going to watch a little video that's talking about biodiversity that's going to tell you how important it is and how it makes ecosystems stronger. So the more diverse life is in a specific place, the more it is able to withstand shocks. So again, evolution generates biological diversity. So a species is a population or a group of populations that have shared characteristics and can breed with each other to produce fertile offspring. Sometimes they look very similar in a species. I'll show you an example, and sometimes they don't. A population is a group of individuals of a species living in the same area. So you can have two populations of a given species living in two separate areas that aren't intermingling, and eventually over a long period of time, the odds are pretty good because of that geographic separation that they will evolve into separate species. So biological evolution is genetic change in a population over time that then can lead to speciation, right? Genetic changes lead to changes in appearance, functioning, or behavior over generations, and it takes quite some time, right? So especially when we think about human evolution, it's not necessarily this straight line. There's all kinds of branches that offshoot that don't lead to anything until you finally wind up with us. And so it can be driven by natural selection, right? So each of these species here had some type of variation and that was very, very well suited to that environment, and therefore they had more babies. And so that became how they evolved. It can also, actually, we're going to continue with that, sorry. So originally there was this guy Lamarck who was pre-Darwin, and he thought evolution happened kind of, I guess, it was kind of driven by an inner need. So he thought that you had a short-necked giraffe who kept stretching to try to want to reach these trees, and somehow the fact that he spent his life stretching made his offspring have longer necks and made their offspring have longer necks, and the necks become progressively longer based upon the need of the previous population, which is wrong. That is not how evolution occurs. Instead, what happens is in a given population of giraffes, right, when they were short-necked, some of them would have longer necks, right? Just like we have genetic variation in our population where some people are short, some people are tall. And so giraffes had giraffes with longer necks had an advantage, and therefore they got more food, and therefore they had more babies, and they passed in their long necks. And then the next generation, there is some that have longer necks than others. The ones with longer necks, more food, more babies. So this giraffe right here, haha, I am taller and will get more leaves, and therefore I will have more babies, and they will be tall too, right? So there's natural genetic variation that occurs within any population, and sometimes that genetic variation gives you a leg up on other people in that population. You're going to pass on more of your genes. And we can see this happening in very, very, very short term with something called the peppered moth. So the peppered moth, which is right here, these are actually both the peppered moth, but this is what it originally looked like, lived in England, lived on these trees that were this kind of color, and camouflaged very well so it wouldn't get eaten by birds. After London industrialized, the more and more pollution, the trees started darkening from that pollution, and there were already some moths in the peppered moth population that looked like this, just as a result of genetic variation. Well, when the trees darkened, these guys had an advantage. More of these guys were eaten, and all of a sudden the peppered moth population became very dark in color. Now that London has cleaned up a lot of its pollution, it's starting to go in reverse. Now more of these guys are surviving because if you look here, here's that peppered moth. He's much more well blended than this guy is right here. And if this was occurring over a long period of time, eventually you could wind up with some type of speciation there. We can also artificially select things in order to, we can select certain characteristics and breed them. We've done this with farming, right? Broccoli, cauliflower, Brussels sprouts, and cabbage all come from a common ancestral plant that we then bred different plants together that had desirable characteristics, wound up with these different things. We've also done it with dogs, right? Dogs can all mate with one another unless there's some type of size restriction. But these are my two dogs, which are two different breeds of dogs, but they are the same species, right? You can have, this one is a black lab and pointer mix, but we have artificially selected for, we have bred certain dogs together to have certain characteristics that we like, and that's why we get this really big variation of dogs, but they're all still part of the same species, but eventually they could not be. And again, things become new species because of geographic isolation as well, if they're separated from other populations. So I talked about tortoises. One of the other things that Darwin studied in the Galapagos Islands was finches. And so they have a common ancestor, but these finches on different islands have evolved different characteristics so that they become different birds. They have different types of beaks that help them eat different types of insects or fruits or seeds depending on what's available on that island. And so you can get like very kind of unique examples of speciation, which is why islands, and so here's an actual island, not a metaphorical one, Madagascar, where lemurs are, and they're the only place that that exists. Generally speaking, islands have a lot of speciation that happens because they're separated. The Hawaiian Islands had a ton of species. A lot of them were choked out by invasive species after Europeans arrived. These are these really unique fish that live in these kind of tiny little freshwater holes. They can actually kind of climb up the side, right? They're not intermingling with anything else. There's no adjacent water for them to travel through. This is just connected by groundwater. Next, we're going to talk about biomes. Biomes are kind of different types of vegetation, large vegetation that exists based upon climate. So we have major types of biomes, forests, which include tropical forests, mid-latitude forests, and boreal forests. You don't have to know all of these. We have scrub and savanna grasslands. We have deserts. We have tundras. So the big idea, there's two big ideas here. One, the amount of producers are dependent upon a climate. And the second big idea is life in each biome is adapted to succeed in this climate, right? So things that have adapted there are very well adapted to that climate. With climate change, one of the concerns is while some animals may be able to migrate, trees are not going to be able to migrate. So we're in kind of in the middle of, not just from climate change, but from other characteristics, kind of this mass extinction event where species are going extinct pretty darn rapidly. And so if you look a map here of, here is a map of climate types, and here is a map of biomes, there's a lot of lining up, right? These biomes are these biomes are very, very dependent upon these climate types. And so we have specific ways that plants adapt to live successfully in different types of climates, right? So we have hygrophytic plants that evolve in places of lots of water, right? So you have these ferns in the Big Island of Hawaii that evolved here, right, to kind of soak up all of this water, these huge broadleaf things. And we also, in these hygrophytic environments, get like tall trees, broad leaves. In xerophytic environments with very little water, we tend to get things like this, these thick, waxy structures, right? It's very hard for water to evaporate through this. Also hard for a lot of animals to eat, right? That's why cactuses, cacti are so aggressive. It's because it's preventing its adaptation to hold on to its water and prevent other animals to eat it in order to get that water. So again, spikes and big roots, right? Cacti have to have big roots to go down and kind of soak up as much groundwater as they can. Where a lot of things, if you have tons of surface water, your roots don't have to dig very deep in order to get your water supply. We have tree adaptations, so deciduous and evergreen adaptations. Deciduous trees lose their leaves in the winter or during a dry season. So here's a picture of fall. I'm from a place where fall looks like this, and I miss it every year that I'm not there. But basically, in order to save water in its trunk, it drops all of its leaves. It kind of goes into a little bit of a hibernation during the winter. And these include trees like baobabs, maples, and oaks. Evergreen trees, they do not lose their leaves in the winter. This includes things like conifers, pine trees. Basically, they have these outside waxy surfaces with this high surface area, and they use that as a way to kind of hold on to their water. So two different adaptations to the same climatic variation. The last thing we're going to talk about in this chapter, and I believe you're going to watch a video about too, is fire adaptation. Fire is part of some ecosystems, and it's part of our ecosystem in Southern California. Some plants require fire to germinate, and that means that fires naturally occur. We do set some by accident, but fires naturally occur. And there are plants that have adapted that basically when a fire comes through and wipes everything out, that is when that plant drops its seeds. It has that nice kind of blank canvas to then repopulate. Non-native plants and humans development disrupt this. So non-native plants that come in might do really well, but they might provide a lot of fuel for the fire and therefore burn really fast and kind of wipe out all of the vegetation when a fire comes through. And again, we build our houses in a lot of these fire ecosystems. We may plant vegetation near our house that is not native and therefore does not do well with fire and might burn really rapidly. Oops, excuse me. So again, fire is part of some ecosystems. There's lots of plants that are adapted to fire. We, as a country, went through a period of time. Smokey the Bear became very popular, and the idea was to put out all fires, all forest fires. Fires were bad. You need to put them out. And what they noticed was certain trees like the giant sequoia, there were no new sequoia when they were doing such strict fire restriction. And basically, sequoias need some of that underbrush to be cleared by fire in order for new sequoias to take hold. So they are adapted to that fire ecosystem. So now fire management is much different in places like national parks and national forests. Some fires that are low risk and isolated and not big and under certain conditions will be allowed to burn. And also, they will do controlled burns. The last time I was in Grand Canyon National Park, I was going through and you could see little pieces that were on fire, that were being controlled burns by ragers. There were signs that said, this is a controlled burn. Don't worry about it, kind of move on your way. So we've started to acknowledge that fire is part of the ecosystem. So you're going to proceed on to some videos and your next exercise, and then I will meet you back for chapter 13.